once and for all. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President,
Senator from Maryland.
you're saying something pretty historic with over half of the women of the Senate speaking on this issue. I know the press isn't covering it, but I hope on C-SPAN they are. This is a bipartisan effort with 30 reforms that we've agreed to, and it is very, very impressive that we're all here speaking up with one voice, an occasional difference in goals, and I hope America's watching, because this hasn't ever happened before. I now turn to the gentlelady from Wisconsin for her remarks, and then the gentlelady from Missouri, and then the gentlelady from Washington State.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wisconsin.
Mr. President, I rise this morning to speak about this year's National Defense Authorization legislation and the important reforms that are a part of the underlying bill to improve our military's response to sexual assault within its ranks. The men and women in our armed services serve with courage in defense of our freedoms every single day. In my eyes, their service needs to be respected by taking decisive action to address the ongoing crisis. In fact, you can call it an epidemic of sexual assault in the military. We know that the system is broken, and it is long past time that we fix it. I want to share just one story from a remarkable and brave woman named Rachel, who lives in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Rachel joined the Army in 2004. She was sexually assaulted that same year while she was stationed at Fort Meade in Maryland for advanced individual training. After reporting her assault to her commanding officer, Rachel was interrogated for hours over numerous days and ultimately forced to drop the charge. She was written up for fraternization, and her assailant was not charged with any crime. As you can imagine, Rachel was deeply affected by the trauma of this crime and continues to face struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder. But Rachel is a survivor and a true inspiration. She has turned her pain and courage into a platform for advocacy and service to her community. Working through her organization, Survivors Empowered Through Art, to raise awareness about military sexual assault through the power of art and storytelling. Rachel's story is a reminder that she is not alone, and that we must do everything that we can to make sure that all victims of sexual assault have the support that they deserve. That's why I'm heartened by the many important reforms included in the 2014 National Defense Authorization Act, and very grateful to the bipartisan coalition, in particular of women senators who have worked so diligently to make this change happen. In particular, Senators Gillibrand and McCaskill have led the fight to make these improvements. Their efforts will make a real difference in the lives of countless Americans by preventing sexual assault in the military and greatly improving our support to victims. However, I believe that more must be done to help victims of sexual assault. And that is why I am a proud co-sponsor of Senator Gillibrand's amendment, which would improve on these important reforms by removing the prosecution of major crimes from the military chain of command. Instead, military prosecutors would determine whether to move a case forward, which would eliminate inherent bias and conflicts of interest which currently deter victims from reporting sexual assault crimes in the first place. I'm also filing an amendment to ensure that we're including ROTC programs in our conversations about military sexual assault. Just like we must ensure that our new officers from service academies meet our highest standards, we must do the same of those commissioned in ROTC programs across America. I think the important improvements in this year's defense authorization show the great promise of what can be achieved if we work together in a bipartisan way to get things done for the American people. I have to tell you, it's a tremendous privilege to be a public servant. It's a special privilege to be the first woman elected from my state to the U.S. Senate. And one of the best parts for me is that I get to be a woman in the Senate at a time when there's so many incredible other women in the Senate to work with, to learn from, to look up to. I want to expressly thank my Senate colleagues who serve on the Armed Services Committee, Senators McCaskill and Hagan, Shaheen and Gillibrand, Hirono, Ayotte, and Fisher. I want to thank them for their work in guiding this process through their committee in such an effective and bipartisan way. My thanks, of course, go as well to Senator Levin and Inhofe for their stewardship of these important provisions. I'd like to thank Senators Mikulski and Collins for organizing today's floor speeches. The cumulative total of these changes represent true progress in eliminating the tragedy and scourge of sexual assault in our military. And I once again thank my colleagues for their bipartisan work and yield back.
Mr. President,
Senator from Missouri.
I, too, want to thank my colleagues, Senator Mikulski and Senator Collins, for making an effort today to highlight the work that has been done on this important issue. I would be less than candid if I didn't say it has been frustrating to have one policy difference dominate the discussion of this issue over the previous few weeks without anyone even realizing the historic reforms that are contained in this bill. And so I welcome the opportunity to come with my colleagues who may disagree on one policy issue but don't disagree on the goal and are taking a moment to recognize the work that has been put into this bill by not just the women of the Armed Services Committee but also the men of the Armed Services Committee. After hearings, and some of us have spent literally hundreds of hours poring over trial transcripts, spending time visiting with prosecutors, I think we have fashioned historic and amazing changes that are going to forever change the successful prosecution of rapists in our military and go further to protect victims. I come to this issue with a great deal of experience. I think it is not hyperbole or overstating it that I have stood in the courtroom prosecuting sexual predators more than any member of the United States Senate. Hundreds and hundreds of cases I have handled. Dozens and dozens and dozens of jury trials. No one in this chamber has intersected with victims of sexual assault more than I have. And I don't think anyone has more of an understanding of the particularly complicated problems that these cases present, especially when there is a consent defense. And keep in mind that the vast majority of these cases in the military are consent defenses. You have two defenses in a sexual assault case. One is, it wasn't me, and the other is, it was consensual activity. So it doesn't take someone much to understand the principle that in this instance, most of these cases are going to be consent defenses. Now, why do I emphasize that? I emphasize it because it's relevant. It's particularly relevant to the reforms that we embrace in the underlying bill. The time period in which a victim decides that she is going to come forward out of the shadows and hold her perpetrator accountable is invariably very close in time to the time of report. It is how she is treated at that juncture more so than anything else, more so than whether she's been victimized in the military or whether she's been victimized on the streets of your hometown. She is coming forward with the most personally painful moment of her life. Now, keep in mind that if you're coming forward the most personally painful moment of your life, how complicated that gets if you know the defense is going to be that you wanted it, that it was consensual. And then it is even more difficult. That's why the vast majority of these crimes in our country are never reported, ever. Doesn't matter whether we're talking military or civilian. So how can we, at that critical moment, make sure that victim gets the help and support she or he needs to do the unthinkable, and that is to lay herself or himself bare to the public about what has happened? Well, the way you do that is through the reforms that my colleague, Senator Murray, stressed and that we have incorporated in this bill, and that is that every single victim gets their own lawyer. I don't think many members understand how extraordinary that is. That reform alone will make our military the most victim-friendly criminal justice system in the world. In no other criminal justice system anywhere, civilian, military, United States, our allies, does a victim get that kind of support. And that's what's underlying in these reforms. We already know it works because it's been a pilot program in the Air Force. And unlike those who say reporting will never go up unless we make another policy change, reporting is spiking in our military. Up 50% just this year. And that is because the victims are getting the word. Not only do you not have to report in the chain of command, you're going to begin to get the resources, support, and help and knowledge you need to navigate the choppiest waters, emotionally and personally, that you will ever encounter. So not only have we done that in the underlying bill, we also have done other things, like stripping commanders of their ability to abuse this system by changing the outcome of a trial. Very important. Making the crime of retaliation a reality in the military. It should be actionable in a criminal court within the military if you retaliate against a victim who reports. And now, not only will the victim know that retaliation is a crime, not only will the unit know retaliation is a crime, the victim has her own lawyer who can help press those charges if that occurs. I mean, think of the practical consequences of this reform. You go back into your unit, you're retaliated in, you call your lawyer. You're not going to believe what they did to me today. That lawyer immediately helps you bring charges against those who might retaliate. It requires automatic discharge from the military for rape or assault convictions. There will be other opportunities to debate the policy difference that we have about how these cases are handled in the military. But I cannot say how grateful I am to the Dean and to Senator Collins for doing this today. It is very important that we not lose sight that this isn't about a bumper sticker, that isn't about one side versus the other. This is about doing the very best job we can on the policy so that we can protect victims, prosecute offenders, and get them the hell out of our military. That's what this is about. And with every fiber of my being, I believe we are going to accomplish that with the reforms that we're embracing. I will come back to the floor to talk more about the amendment I'll be offering on the floor to go even further with some of these reforms that we think are necessary. And I am so grateful that my colleagues have taken a moment to recognize the obvious, that what we've done is historic, that what we've done we do in agreement, and what we've done is going to make a difference. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, how much time do we have under this morning business agreement?
All time in morning business has currently expired.
We have two more speakers and senators, the gentlelady from Massachusetts and Washington State. I ask unanimous consent morning business be extended for these two for approximately 10 minutes.
Is there objection? Seeing no objection, the request is granted.
I now yield to the gentlelady from Washington State and then from Massachusetts.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, first I want to thank the senator from Maryland and the senator from Maine for helping to bring so many of us to the floor today to talk about an issue that really cuts across partisan lines and has plagued our nation's military and has gone unaddressed for far too long. Military sexual assault is an epidemic, and it has rightly been identified as such by the Pentagon. It is absolutely unconscionable that a fellow service member, the person you rely on to have your back and to be there for you, would commit such a terrible crime. It is simply appalling that they could commit such a personal violation of their brother or sister in uniform. But what's worse and what has made change an absolute necessity is the prevalence of these crimes. Recent estimates tell us that 26,000 service members are sexually assaulted each year, and just over 3,000 of those assaults are reported. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, about 1 in 5 female veterans treated by the VA has suffered from military sexual trauma. 1 in 5. That is certainly not the act of a comrade. It is not in keeping with the ethos of any of the services, and it can no longer be tolerated. And that is why the women of the Senate have been united in calling for action. Mr. President, there has been made much of the fact that there are now 20 women in the Senate, an historic number that I think we all agree can still grow. But it's important to remember that the number alone should not be what is historic. Instead, it's what we do with our newfound strength to address the issues that are impacting women across the country. With this bill, the first defense authorization of this Congress, we are doing exactly that. We are taking historic action to help service members access the resources they need to seek justice without fear. And, Mr. President, one way this bill will do just that, how it will protect our service members and assist victims and punish criminals, is through the inclusion of a bill I introduced across party lines with Senator Ayotte. Our bill, which is included in the base bill, creates a new category of legal advocates called Special Victims Counsels. They would be responsible for advocating on behalf of the interests of the victim. These Special Victims Counsels would advise the victim on the range of legal issues they may face. For example, when a young private first class is intimidated into not reporting a sexual assault by threatening her with unrelated legal charges like underage drinking, this new advocate would be there to protect her and tell her the truth. Since January now, the Air Force has provided these advocates to over 500 victims through an innovative new pilot program. 10 months later, the results are speaking for themselves. 92% of victims are extremely satisfied with the advice and support their SVC lent them through the military judicial process. 98% would recommend other victims request these advocates, and 93% felt that these advocates effectively fought on their behalf. In describing their experience with an advocate, one victim shared that, quote, "Going through this was the hardest thing I ever had to do in my life. Having a special victim counsel helped tremendously. No words could describe how much I appreciate having one of these advocates." So, Mr. President, through our bipartisan efforts, the Defense Authorization Bill will also enhance the responsibility and authority of DoD's Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office, known as the SAPRO. This improvement will help to provide better oversight of efforts to combat military sexual assault across the armed forces. SAPRO would also be required to regularly track and report on a range of MSA statistics, including assault rates and the number of cases brought to trial and compliance within each of the individual services. Now, some of this data collection is already being done, so this requirement is not going to be too burdensome, but it will give the office authority to track and report to us on the extent of the problem. Mr. President, I believe the great strength of our military is in the character and dedication of our men and women who wear that uniform. It is the courage of these Americans to volunteer to serve that are the Pentagon's greatest asset. I know it's said a lot, but take a moment to really think about that. Our service members volunteer to face danger, to put their lives on the line, to protect our country and all its people. When we think of those dangers, we think of IEDs. We think of battles with insurgents. We shouldn't have to focus on the threats they encounter from their own fellow service members. And we should never allow for a culture in which the fear of reporting a crime allows a problem like this to fester year after year. These are dangers that can never be accepted, and none of our courageous service members should ever have to face them. Earlier this year, I asked Navy Secretary Ray Mabus about the sexual assault epidemic, and I was glad he told me that, quote, concern was not a strong enough word to describe how he feels about this problem. He said he is angry about it. And I know many of us here are as well, particularly our female colleagues who have dedicated so much time to this issue, share this feeling and want to put an end to this epidemic. So I am hopeful that we can work quickly to do right by our nation's heroes, because when our best and brightest put on a uniform and join the United States Armed Forces, they do so with the understanding that they will sacrifice much in the name of defending our country and its people. But that sacrifice should never have to come in the form of abuse from their fellow service members. I'm proud that the women in this Senate have taken this issue head on. And what should never be lost in the effort to enact the many changes that have been proposed is that for too long, this was an issue that was simply swept under the rug. That is no longer the case. Thanks to bipartisan cooperation, the work of thousands of dedicated advocates, and the voices of countless victims who have bravely spoken out. We are poised to make a difference on an issue that women everywhere have brought out of the shadows. And I am proud of the women that have worked so hard on this issue. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to express my strong support for efforts to stamp out sexual assault in our military. And I want to begin by thanking the Senator from Maryland and the Senator from Maine for your extraordinary leadership in bringing us here today to speak out on this issue. For over 20 years, our military has said that it has a zero-tolerance policy towards sexual violence. Government agencies have put out 20 reports examining the problem and suggesting potential solutions. And yet, shamefully, incidents of sexual assault involving our military personnel continue at staggering rates. Data from the Department of Defense indicate that thousands of men and women serving in the military are subject to these horrific experiences every year. More than 20% of women serving in the military have reported unwanted sexual contact at some point during the course of their military service. And perhaps most shameful, about half of all female victims in a 2012 DoD survey indicated they did not report these crimes because they believed that such reports would simply be ignored. This is an outrageous situation. We have called on the military over and over to solve this problem, and they have failed. Simply calling once again on the military to reform will be an exercise in futility. Worse, it will be a breach of trust with the men and women who are future victims of sexual predators lurking in the military. These are important steps forward that we take today. We take the number of extremely strong provisions to address sexual assault included in this year's National Defense Authorization Act will move us in the right direction. These provisions are designed to crack down on sexual assaults, to better protect and advocate for victims, and to change the climate within our military to one that ends this despicable conduct. The bill includes provisions to promote the prosecution of these cases by eliminating the statute of limitations on certain sexual offense cases and by limiting the ability of commanding officers to modify court-martial findings in sexual offense cases. The bill requires the provision of a special victims counsel to provide legal support for service members who are victims of sexual violence at the hands of other members of the military, and take steps to limit the potential for victims to be mistreated by defense counsel. There are other important steps forward in this bill, and as the Senate debates the defense bill, we will consider additional provisions to prosecute and eliminate sexual assault. I support those efforts as well. The issue of sexual violence within our armed forces is very personal to me. All three of my brothers served in the military. My oldest brother was career military and flew 288 combat missions in Vietnam. I know the unbelievable sacrifices that our military men and women make for this country and the sacrifices their families make to support them. And yet, in spite of those sacrifices, we as a nation have consistently refused to take sufficient steps to ensure that our military men and women are protected from sexual violence on the job. Tolerance for sexual assaults demeans the sacrifices that millions of brave men and women have stepped forward to make on our behalf. We owe it to our service members and to their families to change the culture in our military that remains far too tolerant of this abuse. We owe it to our service members and to their families to do everything in our power to stamp out these incidents. No matter the outcome of this week's amendment votes, this year's Defense Authorization Act will make significant strides toward finally making the military's zero-tolerance policy a reality. I am proud to support these efforts, and I promise that so long as these crimes continue to occur, so long as victims are fearful to come forward, so long as justice is denied to victims, I promise that we will be back right here next year and the year after that and the year after that, doing everything we can to end sexual assault in the military. The brave men and women serving in our armed forces have no intention of giving up on us, and we have no intention of giving up on them. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield my time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, with the eloquent statement by the gentlelady from Massachusetts, we are now concluding the time that the women of the Senate have taken on a bipartisan basis to speak out against sexual assault in the military and to speak for the 30 reforms that we all have agreed upon on a bipartisan basis that will enable prosecutorial reform, help to the victims, guarantee the fairness for the process, and make sure that if you come forward, that you will not be retaliated against, you will not be ignored, but if you're also accused, you will get a fair process. I'm really proud of the way the 7 women on the Armed Services Committee led this, and then joined by the rest of us, social workers, advocates, former attorney generals are here. And we couldn't have done it, though, without the very good men on the committee, particularly the chairmanship of Senator Levin and the help of Senator Inhofe. And I note the gentleman from Rhode Island is here, Senator Reid. We want to thank him for his strong advocacy for women, the advancement of women in the military, and also these important reforms. I also just want to say something as the Dean of the Women. This is pretty historic what we did this morning. You know, you had 10 women from the United States Senate across the aisle speaking out on 30 goals, 30 reforms that were agreed to in the underlining bill. This is what the American people wanted, us working together with the chairman of the committee, listening to victims, listening to experts, listening to the military. And you know what's disappointing to me? There was one person in the press gallery. Now, if we had been in conflict, then there will be a difference later on where there are some differences in some policy. That's okay with me. But we don't make press anymore. We don't make press when we've actually worked together and worked with such incredible diligence and expertise among ourselves to solve these really egregious and historically intransigent problems. So I say to the press, we know you like conflict, you know you like controversy, you particularly want to see it among the women. Well, you know, we have a precedent where we have disagreed before on goals. When I got the fight with Lily Goodbetter, Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson took me on with 9 amendments. We had a good debate, and we had a good bill at the end of it. Senator Murkowski, the gentlelady from Alaska, has also disagreed with me on some matters on what should be the best approach on preventive health. Debate, diligence, without personal conflict, we then came up with some good ideas. And I say here today, when I listen to our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, again with great backgrounds, and here today, this is pretty historic. So if you're watching on C-SPAN, you saw history being made. 10 of us, and there will be more later on today, where we actually agreed. We are trying to govern the way we were elected to govern. And I'm proud of what we're going to do with the reforms that are there. I'm proud of the way we've gone about it. And if we disagree on some matters here or there, that's what debate, intellectual rigor, and civility will be all about. So, Mr. President, I'm going to conclude this debate for now. Other women will be coming throughout the day, and we know we will be debating some other important policy goals. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S. 1197, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 91, S. 1197, the bill to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2014 for military activities of the Department of Defense and so forth, and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, the time until 12:30 p.m. will be for debate only.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Yes, and ask consent the quorum call in progress be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I think everyone is aware that we have a lot of differences on both sides of the aisle, and quite frankly, I just had a meeting with some of the House people, and so there are some problems right now. I'm anxious for Chairman Levin to come back perhaps after our conferences, and I'd do the same thing, and hopefully we'll be able to do it. I understand that there's already been a statement made about the AYOT amendment. Is that correct? And on the Guantanamo, and she's ready to debate, and I think Senator Levin has a side-by-side amendment that he is ready to debate too. So that, in my opinion, is about as far as we've come on progress, and I'd withhold any other comments I've made until after the chairman has made his comments, which would probably be after lunch. Oh, by the way, I would ask our members to continue to file all the amendments that they can have, just in anticipation that we're, as we have in the past, ultimately come to that conclusion that we're going to have amendments, hopefully.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I have a unanimous consent that's been approved by the majority and minority leaders, and if I'd like to present it at this time. Mr. President, I have 6 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent
Senator from Oklahoma.
That to extend floor privileges to Major Richard Anderson, our Army fellow, for the remainder of this calendar year.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to discuss again how Obamacare is negatively impacting American families. NBC News is reporting that 5 million Americans have received cancellation notices from health insurers. In my own state of South Dakota, the Sioux Falls Argus Leader is reporting that nearly 3,000 people have lost the plan that they had. Yet this administration is merely pursuing political band-aids for the problem created by the President's health care law. The President's trying to fix this problem of canceled plans, but his solution is politically motivated band-aid in response to pressure from members of his own party who are nervous about the next election. The unfortunate reality of his band-aid is that it won't work. Instead of taking responsibility for his failed policies and broken promises, he's changing his mind about how he wants his law to work at the 11th hour. He's kicking the can to state insurance regulators to determine whether, in 48 days, which is from the date of his announcement on Thursday, they can reverse a train wreck that has been barreling down the tracks for nearly 4 years. The President's health care law told the entire country that compliance with the President's law must occur on January 1st of 2014, and in response, industry and state regulators complied. Now, after relentlessly pushing a law that is fundamentally flawed, the President is changing his mind. He's expecting state insurance commissioners to bail him out to allow Americans to keep the plans that they were promised that they could keep. Since passage of his health care law, the President continued to tout his law and continued to make promises to the American people that he knowingly could not keep. While I agree that Americans should be able to keep the plans that they have and like, this 11th hour attempt at a fix is an indication that the underpinnings of this law are irreversibly flawed. The administration is now trying to live up to a promise it made despite the fact that they knew the promise wasn't true. In fact, the President repeated and reiterated that promise as recently as September 26, despite the fact that the administration knew it wasn't true. In 2010, the administration knew that up to 93 million Americans in the private market were in danger of losing their current health care plan. But the deeper problem with the President's fix is it is merely a Band-Aid. By this time next year, Americans will be in this exact same situation all over again. The President is not focused on finding a good permanent solution, but a good political solution. Putting this Band-Aid on the problem now may get him and his party past next year's elections. He seems more interested with preserving that power than creating real solutions to the underlying issues. In fact, the President is so concerned about the politics of his actions that he's considering yet again a way to bail out his union friends. As part of the health care law, unions agreed to pay a tax to help pay for the cost of expanding coverage. This tax, known as the reinsurance tax, is scheduled to be paid by self-insured plans, including plans administered by unions in many of the largest businesses in America. But the unions are unhappy that they have to pay money into a fund to be used to help fund a benefit for someone other than their dues-paying members. They took their complaints to the administration and buried in a regulation issued last month. The administration announced that they intend to exempt unions from paying this tax. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal editorial page articulated exactly why the union should not be exempt from this tax. The editorial, called Obama's Union Favor, argues, and I quote, that the unions ought to consider this tax a civic obligation in solidarity with the uninsured working folk that they claim to support, end quote. It further states, and I quote again, there's no conceivable rationale other than politics for releasing union-only plans from a tax, end quote. And as the editorial pointed out, exempting unions from this tax will only mean increased taxes on non-unionized Americans and self-insured plans, since the tax is structured in a way that it must raise a total of $25 billion and isn't structured as a straight percentage like most taxes are. Now, granting this political deal to unions is why I'm introducing the Union Tax Fairness Act. This bill would ensure that unions live up to the commitments they made when they put their political weight behind the health care law. It is political deals like this that highlight how this law is failing the average American. This reinsurance fee exemption isn't the only backroom deal the administration is trying to grant unions. Earlier this fall, the administration tried to find a way to provide Obamacare subsidies to ineligible union employees. And I introduced a bill called the Union Bailout Prevention Act, which was aimed at ensuring the administration cannot make that special deal either. Mr. President, it's clear that this President, President Obama, is trying to fix problems in his health care law by making decisions and exemptions based on favors to his political allies. Democrats are on the run from the law that they once championed. They recognize this law is sagging under its own weight. And last week, there were 39 House Democrats who voted against the Obama administration by supporting the Upton bill that provides a better solution to allowing Americans to keep plans they like than what the President has proposed. Even former President Bill Clinton said that President Obama should keep his word when it comes to allowing Americans to keep the plans that they have and like. And in this chamber, several Senate Democrats are running for the exits and looking for a legislative escape hatch of their own. Unfortunately, the solutions proposed by this administration to fix problems in the health care law are only temporary solutions. Their solutions to problems are either temporary delays, which they did with the employer mandate and the one-year extension of 2013 plans, or political favors to their friends and allies. Instead, this administration should agree to delay this entire law for all Americans. Americans are deeply skeptical of the Affordable Care Act. According to last week's Gallup poll, 55% of Americans now disapprove of the health care law, and there was a more recent poll this morning, ABC News, Washington Post, that has that number at 57% disapproving. Madam President, the time to act is now to ensure Americans can keep the plans that they have and like. This fix won't prevent Americans from losing their coverage, facing sticker shock and premium increases, or losing their doctor. This law is fundamentally broken, and we need to start over and enact real reforms that decrease costs and improve access to care. And Madam President, like so many of us in this chamber, I hear on a daily basis from my constituents in South Dakota about the impact, the very real impact, that this is having on middle-income Americans. This is an email that I received last week. John, my wife just received our health care insurance policy renewals for 2014, and we are in shock. Our monthly premiums increased from $400 per month to $1,000, or over $7,000 more per year. My wife, age 59, and me, age 60, now receive maternity benefits and some other very limited coverage. We lost our prescription drug copay and doctor visits copay. These expenses will now be included in our $6,300 deductible. I will have no option for any subsidy to offset these increases in premiums. It goes on to say, please, please push for a reversal of this horrible health care plan. My wife and I are physically ill after receiving this letter from our insurance carrier. Again, the government is destroying our lives, and we need you to stop this madness. Madam President, that's just one example, again, of many that I have heard from my state of South Dakota and many that my colleagues here in the Senate are hearing from all across this country. It is clear that this plan, this program, this health insurance law is not ready for prime time. It is time for us to take a time out and to go back to the drawing board and construct a plan, an insurance program for this country, legislation that will help reduce the cost for working-class Americans, give them access to better quality of care, and allow them to keep the doctor that they choose, which is very much in jeopardy as well as a result of this takeover, literally, of 1/6 of our economy. Madam President, there's a better way, as I think countless now, millions of Americans are finding out through canceled coverages, sticker shock by skyrocketing premiums, and the new knowledge that they may not be able to keep not only their health insurance plan, but also the doctor that they like. This is a reality, a grim reality for way too many Americans, and it's time for us to step forward and to do something about it. What the President has proposed is a Band-Aid, is a political solution. It's not a permanent solution. It is temporary. We need long-term fixes put in place that will address the health care concerns that people in this country have. But, Madam President, the way to do that isn't to have the federal government literally assume control of 1/6 of the American economy and all the decision-making that that takes out of the hands of ordinary middle-class families. People across this country are working hard to take care of their families. Madam President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Alabama.
Madam President, we need to be moving forward with the defense bill. It's very important. I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee, and we've had a good bipartisan vote out of committee to bring the bill to the floor. Chairman Levin has been fair to us in committee, so we had a good committee process. But there are some disagreements over a number of issues that the full Senate needs to discuss and vote on. They just should be able to do that. And we're drifting into a process that's absolutely contrary to the history of the Senate, the real concept of the United States Senate, where we bring matters up and vote on them. And just because it cleared our committee doesn't mean that a full Senate doesn't get to vote on some of these differing opinions. And I voted in the committee on a number of amendments that didn't pass. We had amendments up in committee that we decided not to vote on. And the phrase was, well, we will carry that to the floor. In other words, it will be brought up and the whole Senate will vote on it, not just the committee. Maybe in the interim something could be worked out, but if not, it would go to the full Senate, and the full Senate would work its will, would have its debate and vote. And we're going days now with nothing happening, no amendments being voted on. They could have already have been voted on. And so Senator Reid has filled the tree, and that means he has complete control over the process. He has the ability to say, we will not have a single amendment, and in fact, except for, I think, two, all he's agreed to in his process is to have maybe 2 amendments up. And that's unacceptable. Senator Reid ought to know that. You can't move the defense bill of the United States of America, spending on $500 billion, and not have amendments, and senators actually offer suggestions on how to spend that money better and do better for America. I mean, what are we here for? So, I am really worried about this. I'm afraid that this whole thing could collapse over the failure of amendments to be offered. I just looked here at a chart back basically when Republicans were in charge, and we had 27 amendments, 25 amendments, 13 amendments actually voted on. The average number were 11.5 amendments voted on. We already have well over 100 amendments filed. Over half of them, 2/3 of them, will eventually be withdrawn, or they'll get, the managers of the bill will agree to some form of that suggestion for a different language, and we'd move on. But we should already have been started on amendments, and we should already we should recognize that a good defense bill is going to require an open process where we can actually discuss how to fix it and make it better. In addition, we're facing, under the Budget Control Act and the sequester, some real financial challenges for the Department of Defense that are historic. And it is significant. We need to be able to talk about that and work on that and try to figure out a way to strengthen the ability of the Defense Department to function in a rational way and not do unnecessary damage to them while they work to contain spending. That is a critical thing. So I would say to Senator Reid, who has got a tough job, there's no doubt about that. Senator Reid, you should not attempt this dramatic reduction in the ability of the Senate to actually have amendments to a bill as large and as important as a defense bill. You are overreaching, Senator Reid. We cannot agree to that. The loyal opposition, the Republican opposition here, I say the bill that came out of committee was bipartisan. Overwhelmingly bipartisan, a big vote in the committee. But there are things that need to be voted on here, and we're not going to agree to a handful of amendments. And so if you try to move forward with this bill without allowing at least a legitimate amendment process, you're not going to go forward, because we're not going to agree to go forward when you fill the tree and block amendments and have the power to deny amendments of any significant degree on the floor of the Senate. I'm worried about that. I hope that my friend Senator Levin and Senator Reid here and others can talk with the majority leader and reason with him, and let's get on with the business of proceeding with these amendments and some actual debate about the future of America's defense posture, because we do have challenges in the years to come, a lot different than we've had, and we need to reconfigure defense, and we need to be asking ourselves honestly and in a bipartisan way, what will we need to do in 15 years? What will we need to be doing in 2025? I had the honor to be at the Reagan Library this weekend for a national security conference dealing with what our defense structure should be in 2025. Senator Reid was given Senator Levin, along with former Secretary of Defense Gates, was given the first award that they give for patriotic service. So our Armed Services Chairman, let me note, was honored, a Democratic chairman, was honored at the Ronald Reagan Library for his commitment to national defense. But I'm just saying, ladies and gentlemen, in a bipartisan way We need to be thinking about what our future defense policy should be. We need to be thinking about how to move this bill, but it will not move, and I will not support going to a bill that does not allow this Senate to have a reasonable opportunity to have amendments. I would thank the chair and would yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, I wanted to come to the floor today to moderate a colloquy between my colleagues for the next 20 minutes or so regarding a very important amendment that's been filed to the Defense Authorization bill that we're considering. The colloquy will be between myself, Senator Wicker, Senator Warren, Senator Cochran, Senator Hoeven, Senator Nelson, and Senator Merkley. I'd like to ask unanimous request that we have the next 20 minutes to conduct this colloquy.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the courtesies of the manager of the bill on the floor, the Senator Reid, and I really appreciate his courtesies because those of us that came to the floor today to speak about this issue are extremely concerned about this problem that's presented itself based on a bill that was passed 2 years ago, called Bigger Waters. With all the best intentions, a bill was passed 2 years ago to try to fix and reform and reauthorize the nation's flood insurance program, which is a very important program that allows millions of people that live not just along the coast, but along our rivers and bayous and streams from coast to coast, inland and coastal communities, to live safely and to live affordably and to have flood insurance that they can count on. That was the intention of the bill, but, Madam President, something went awry through the passage of the bill, and the consequences are devastating. Now, as we look back 2 years and we see how FEMA and some of the federal agencies are implementing the law that we passed, we have some very serious concerns, not only about how they're implementing it, but about the law itself. So a group of us have come together to change that law so that we can provide opportunities for our families, for our individuals and our businesses to be able to buy and keep the kind of flood insurance they need to stay in business and to keep their communities intact. The last couple of weeks, all we've heard about is health care insurance, and that is important, and we've got some things to fix and move forward, providing the country with a health care system that they can depend on. But we also have a real challenge in flood insurance and affordability to our communities. In Louisiana alone, we have 400,000 flood insurance policies. Florida, I see my good friend Senator Nelson on the floor from Florida. He has the largest number of policies, followed by Texas, the second largest, and of course Mississippi has quite a few as well, and Senator Wicker joins me on the floor. I want to start by showing this map so that everyone that is following this debate, and there are literally millions of people following this debate, not only homeowners, business owners, but bankers, real estate, realtors, developers, etc., because if we don't get this right, these communities where you see these dots, where they're the Mardi Gras colors, purple, gold, and green, but these dots represent communities that are being affected by this program that needs to be changed and reformed. These are flood maps that are being issued. Look how many in Oregon and Washington, California, Texas. What really surprised me, because I know the Gulf Coast well, that's the area, of course, that I represent, Louisiana, and I know Texas and Mississippi and Florida very well, but the area that surprised me was Pennsylvania and Illinois and, of course, New York, New Jersey, and the East Coast because of Superstorm Sandy. But this is a national issue. It's not a Louisiana issue. It's not a Gulf Coast issue. It's a national issue. And the other thing I want to point out is you'll notice that these flood maps are not just along the coast. Some people say to us that are working on this, well, I'm not concerned because I don't represent a coastal state. Well, heads up, everyone. Even if you don't represent a coastal state, you're having flood maps issued from North Dakota, South Dakota, interior states, Kansas, Arkansas, et cetera, because you've got rivers and flood zones. And if we do not change this bill in a significant way, and what we're asking for in the Menendez-Isaacson bill, which we're here offering as an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill, many of these communities will be devastated. And that's because in the Biggert Waters bill, it's mandated a fairly steep and unsustainable and unaffordable to the middle class rate increases that will simply prevent people from being able to stay in their homes. And my friend Senator Wicker, who's following me in this colloquy, I'd like to ask him, because he wanted to speak specifically about the hardships that some of our people are experiencing as they're getting these notices about the rate increases. And I was going to ask Senator Wicker, what is he hearing in Mississippi? And could you elaborate a minute about the unintended consequences of Biggert Waters and the increases that some of our people are seeing in their primary home, Senator, as well as their businesses?
Madam President, I thank my colleague from Louisiana for asking that question. And what I'm hearing from Mississippi and what I think we're going to be hearing from all across the United States of America is that this is about to be a disaster.